It is the basis now for virtually every existing or expanded or new government program. Fear of another 9/11, fear of a dirty bomb. You know, don't bother the American public with the details that a dirty bomb is essentially, just some, figment of somebody's imagination. Yes, could somebody take some radioactive material and configure it in a way with some readily available or relatively easily available explosives to concoct an explosive device that does have some radiological elements, radioactive elements in it? Yes. But would it pose a massive danger to large numbers of people, such as would justify arresting somebody just, for example, on the notion that they might have had something or had spoken about this, and imprison them for about 5 years, never charge them with having the dirty bomb, and then you have a trial with them on something else, but in the meantime, you've kept them in isolation, solitary isolation, have granted them no access to the courts, virtually no access to lawyers, and so forth. No, but those are details that most of the public doesn't want to be bothered with. You use the term dirty bomb, and that is enough to strike fear in most people's minds, and our government officials are utterly unashamed in the way they do this, so that fear has become the common denominator for virtually every government program in the post-9/11 world. But we saw and we've seen the roots of this development of this unholy alliance between technology and government power for many, many years. We see it in the way government just uses technology because it's there. Is there any real reason why these surveillance cameras have to start popping up all over the place? No. Every time you go into a parking lot now, they have cameras that record the license plate so that they can make sure that the person pays the money that they're supposed to pay. That's at the root of a lot of this, certainly. Government will never admit that, or rarely admit it. It's a revenue enhancer. It's a revenue item, these surveillance cameras and the surveillance techniques. Cameras are appearing everywhere. Database after database after database is being developed by the government. And even in those uses of technology that pose a very clear and reasonable, or reasonably understood, I should say, danger to people, government doesn't want to hear about that. RFID chips are an example, radio frequency identification chips. The government has decided that they want to put RFID chips in passports. Now, there have been a number of studies, some of which have been conducted by the government itself, others by outside groups, that indicate that implanting an RFID chip in a document, a passport, driver's license, watch out for the Real ID Act, they're going to probably put them in there if that thing goes forward, poses a real security risk to the person that is carrying that item, whether it's a driver's license in your wallet or a passport in your pocket, a jacket pocket or a purse or a briefcase, because despite efforts by the government to convince people that these chips cannot be read remotely by somebody that they don't want to read them remotely, they can be. And even though the government has said, well, they can only be read within a few inches, independent studies have indicated, even with the technology available nowadays, and it grows every day, its capability, they can, in fact, be remotely read remotely, detected remotely, and the information encrypted, and then, of course, used to break into systems from much greater distances away. Does the government care about that? Absolutely not. They're just charging forward because the technology is there. It makes it easier for the government to gather, manipulate, wield, maintain information, and information is power, much more so than in prior ages, prior decades, where more physical attributes of power were the indices whereby one judged government power or national power. The geographic extent of our nation in its first decades, the natural resources of our nation in succeeding decades, the manufacturing, the industrial capability and product of our country as we entered the 20th century. But now, the real power of government, the real power of a nation is in information, and our government recognizes that, and most other industrialized nations do as well. And even though there are differences, we see differences in policies being worked out or manifesting themselves in discussions between the European Union and the United States over the extent of flight passenger information that has to be provided to the U.S. government, and at what point with regard to passengers flying into or out of the United States. Even though there are some differences with regard to the privacy protections and the amount of information and how it's accessed, by and large, most nations are on the same wavelength with regard to the fundamental question of gathering, using, and maintaining that information. The solution is not going to come from government, no matter whether we elect a Republican or a Democrat next year. If in fact we elect a Republican or a Democrat next year, neither party, none of the individuals have a true interest in limiting government power, and none of them will work to limit government power. Ron Paul would, but of the major candidates, none of them will. Congress is not going to all of a sudden awake from its somnambulant state and start listening to the people of this country, at least those that matter, not those that want some pork project in their district. They always have an ear tuned to them. And again, presidents of either of the major parties, they are all part of the same fraternity, whether they are potential candidates, presidents, or ex-presidents. It is all one fraternity, the fraternity of the status quo, and they will protect each other. One party will ensure that even though they may engage in rhetorical battles from time to time, blasting the other, saying they're going to limit the power of the other, in reality it does not happen. Because each party knows, or at least figures it knows, that if they limit the power of the other party, then when they get back into power, they're going to have their power limited. So there's an inherent built-in interest on the part of both parties to maximize the power available to either or both of them. The only way we are truly going to get back to the notion, the Ayn Randian notion of freedom, our founding fathers' notions of freedom. Now, they didn't know Ayn Rand. She wasn't born until much, much later. I think we just celebrated the 100th anniversary of her birth the year before last, I think it may have been. But they were on the same wavelength. They understood. I mean, our founding fathers, every time I read the Constitution and read some of the Federalists, I'm absolutely amazed at the depth of not just their knowledge and their intellect, but their understanding of histories, of the ebb and flow of civilization. They probably studied, I know Madison did, probably studied more civilizations that had fallen than those that had risen. Because what they were looking for is they were looking down the road. Their perspective was not the perspective of a modern politician, 2 years to 4 years maximum. They were looking generations down the road. And they tried to configure through that magnificent document and the system that it built